Well, today Genesis 37, as we begin Joseph's story, it spans all the way to the end of Genesis 37 to 50, so I make that 14 chapters. And it's a fantastic and fascinating story that has actually gripped the imagination of our own culture, as we'll see in a few moments, and I'm sure you may know what I'm referring to anyway. This won't be that new to you, I don't think. You'll have heard some of these things before. So let me read just the first 11 verses of Genesis 37. That's all we're looking at this morning. 37, 1 to 11 on page 41. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah, and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them, about his brothers. Now Israel, that's the other name for Jacob, Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate, we're not exactly sure what this word means, a colored or a long-sleeved robe for him, a special coat at least for him. Only for him. Verse 4, when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of corn out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered round mine and bowed down to it. His brother said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. Listen, he said, I had another dream. And this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream you had? Will your mother and I, that's the sun and moon, will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Okay, so that's just the beginning of the story, and I think some of you will know some of the things that happen next. And I say it's a very popular story in our culture, and probably one you have heard before, and this will give you a flavor of what I mean.
Joseph's mother, she was quite my favorite wife. I never really loved another all my life. And Joseph was my joy because he reminded me of her.
Through young Joseph, Jacob lived his youth again. Loved him, praised him, gave him all he could. But then it made the rest feel second best. And even if they were
being told we're also rats does not make us Joseph fans.
But where they have really missed the boat is
we're great guys, but no one seems to notice.
Joseph's charm and winning smiles failed to slay them in the aisles, and their father couldn't see the danger. He could not imagine any danger. He just saw in Joseph all his dreams come true. Jacob wanted to show the world he loved his son, to make it clear that Joseph was the special one. So Jacob bought his son a coat, a multicolored coat to wear.
Joseph's coat was elegant, the cut was fine.
The tasteful style was the ultimate king of design.
And this is why it caught the eye.
A king would stop and stare.
And when Joseph tried it on, he knew his sheepskin days were gone. Such a dazzling coat of many colors, how he loved his his coat of many colors in a class above the rest. It even went well with his vest. Such a stunning coat of many colors. How he loved his coat of many colors. It was red and yellow and green and brown and blue. Joseph's brothers weren't too pleased with what they saw.
We have never liked him all that much before, and now this coat has got our ghost. We feel life is unfair.
And when Joseph graced the scene, his brothers turned a shade of green. His astounding clothing took the biscuit.
Quite the smoothest person in the district.
I look handsome, I look smart, I am a walking work of art. Such a dazzling coat of many colors, how I love my coat of many colors.
It was red and yellow and green and brown and scarlet and black and ochre and peach and ruby and olive and violet and
I look handsome, I look smart, I am a walking work of art. Such a dazzling coat of many colors, how I love my coat of many colors. It was red and yellow and green and brown and scarlet and black and ochre and peach and ruby and olive and violet and fawn and lilac and gold and chocolate and mauve, cream and crimson and silver and rose and azure and lemon and russet and gray and purple and white and pink and orange and blue.
Have you been? Have you seen it? No? A few people, maybe? No? No. That first, Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice, no relation, came up with that 50 years ago in 1973, and it's pretty much been running ever since. I don't think it's running in the West End at the moment, but in other parts of the world, and it runs in schools and community centres. My son's school ran it. He was Potiphar. They gave him a top hat to be Mr. Potiphar a number of years ago. And that was, of course, called Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. So you've heard of that, I think. And they estimate that it's been played over 20,000 times. Maybe even in this country, I don't know. The other aspect that you'll know about is his dreams. And this is represented, for example, in the DreamWorks film Joseph, King of Dreams, which some of you may also have seen. So this is a very popular story, isn't it, in our culture and across the world. And these, of course, were the main reasons why his brothers hated him, because of that coat, which was an indication of his father's favoritism, his special love for him over all his brothers, and because of those dreams he shared freely with them, where he represented himself as one who would be ruler over them. And of course that did come true, but they hated to hear that. You can kind of understand it. It was a growing hatred, wasn't it? It was a hatred that was all the more, as we read twice in verses 5 and 8. They hated him all the more because of the dream and what he had said. They hated him because of the coat. They hated him because of the dreams. And perhaps they also hated him because of his bad report in verse 2. Although we're not told that maybe they heard from their father. We shouldn't make a judgment about that, I don't think. We perhaps in our minds we naturally think of him as a snitch, a telltale. We're not given a judgment on it. And perhaps, I think we can imagine that his brothers were perhaps mucking around on the job, lazing about, goofing off, and maybe Joseph was concerned about the sheep and the goats and their welfare, and so hurried back to his father. So we don't make a particular judgment, but particularly I think for the reasons of the favoritism that Jacob showed with that lovely coat, ornate robe, kind of a symbol, I think, of rulership, the kind of thing that a prince would wear, for example. That was what Jacob gave Joseph, kind of making him the most special one, taking the place of the firstborn. I don't think Reuben was very happy about that. But also those dreams about his sheaf that their sheaves bowed down to, and the 11 stars, the sun and the moon, the father and mother, and the 11 stars bowing down to him. They hated him intensely for that. And they were jealous of him, as we read in verse 11. Jealous or envious of him. Green with envy. Hatred and jealousy, these are things we're familiar with, aren't we? Is there anybody here who hasn't had such thoughts or experienced such feelings and desires within? However nice we may appear on the surface, the truth is these things can still exist. Even for those who've been Christians for many years, we still struggle, don't we, with those bad thoughts, those nasty thoughts, those unkind, those positively hateful thoughts, jealous and envious of other people for what they have and we don't. Andy, preaching here last Sunday, referred himself to his own hateful thoughts and how he struggles with them. Andy is such a wonderful guy, such a genuine example of a Christian that's hard to imagine, isn't it? Andy struggling with hateful thoughts. Yet he does, and he's, like me, he's still a sinner. I struggle with hateful thoughts, with envious thoughts, with nasty thoughts, with unkind thoughts. It's the way it's meant to be. We all struggle with our own hearts, don't we? It's a struggle that's described in Romans chapter 7. Paul wrote, although I want to do good, evil is right there with me. And I think all of us could say that. As much as we may have good intentions, evil is right there with me. Still at work, isn't it, inside? I know I, for one, have struggled with jealousy or envy. I noticed as I came into middle age, around sort of 40 plus, that it was kind of a new temptation for me. When I was in my 20s, my early 20s particularly, I was very carefree, happy-go-lucky, happy as Larry. But by the time I hit middle age, I began to think, as people do, the midlife crisis, what had I really achieved? And I looked over to my contemporaries, my friends. Some of them seemed to be doing better than I was, making more than I was, bigger house, better car, better income. And I struggled. I noticed I struggled with that in middle age. And even in my professional, my pastoral role as a preacher, I have struggled when I've gone to large conferences. For example, something like the Evangelical Ministry Assembly, which meets, well, I'm not exactly sure where it is now, but it was meeting in the Barbican last time I went. A big turnout of sort of Christian preachers from across the country. And there would be someone, a preacher better than me, clearly better than me at preaching, and younger than me, and better looking than me. And I felt that envy, that feeling of, grrr. And perhaps you too, as you think about the people around you in your workplace, colleagues or friends or people that you were a student with back. Now you look across to them and you see them and they seem to be doing better than you are. They have more than you do. Better house, car, and so forth. And maybe particularly as you go online, as you go onto your phone and you look at Instagram and Facebook, now there's a place, isn't it, for envy to thrive. And you see these wonderful lives, people representing their holidays in Barbados and whatever else they're doing. Their great achievements, just written a book, so forth. And you're tempted to envy. It's a very common dynamic in everyday life, isn't it? envy or jealousy, Instagram and so forth. And the Bible calls us, doesn't it, to fight those desires, those feelings that we have, actually to put them to death, to kill them. And we end up thinking, well, how can I do this? We can kind of understand the brothers here, can't we? They must have been bristling with envy as Jacob shared his dream, and as Joseph shared his dream, and as Jacob robed Joseph with that lovely multicolored or long-sleeved or ornate princely coat that he made only for Joseph and not for anyone else. He must have struggled and well, we know that it led to some terrible things later on. We'll come to that next week. But how do we fight it? How do we battle it? As we struggle with those feelings too. Well, I guess the answer is that we do so by faith, right? That's always the answer, the first answer for a believer. We live by faith, the Bible says, so we live the Christian life by faith. But faith in what specifically? What is going to really help us? What belief is going to help us to battle, to fight, to resist that temptation to look on? And actually the word envy, of interest to you, it literally means to look on look, N-V, to look on other people. And it is as we look on other people, isn't it? As we look on their lives, their marriages, their income, their houses and so forth, that we build up an envy, a jealousy inside us. What are we going to do about that? Well, I think the answer lies in what the Bible calls, or what theology calls, but it is based on the Bible, the doctrine or the teaching about God's providence. Providence. We've touched on this before. The Joseph story is a magnificent example of God's providence, and that refers to how God not only maintains the world that He's made, but manages it, or not only conserves the world He's created, but controls it, and that nothing lies outside the control of God. That everything basically is in His hand. Everything. We know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love. That's a verse about providence. And Alistair Begg, some of you may have heard his name before, he's written a terrific little book about Joseph called The Hand of God. It's the whole Joseph story. And this is kind of what's helped me this week to bring this to you. Here's what he says. If Joseph's brothers had understood that God sovereignly works in people's lives and that He had sovereignly determined to make Joseph the object of His favor, they might have had no occasion to be envious. If they had understood that, if they really believed and understood and held on to that, that's helped me with this. Or at least he said they might have been able to understand God's perspective of what was happening, even if it still bothered them. God sets people up and brings people down. So the people who are raised up mustn't get fat heads, or big heads. And the people who aren't raised up mustn't get discouraged. If only Joseph's brothers had fastened on this truth, and I think therein lies the key, fastened on this truth, they would have saved themselves and their whole family much heartache. Now, of course, what they did was terrible, but God used it, and it all comes under that great umbrella of that verse that we've been using for this year, that I'm sure you remember. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. That is the great umbrella over everything, really. Certainly over the Joseph story, even over our own. You won't mind me telling you that, I don't think. I know. But he wanted to know, as we spoke a little bit about this part of the Bible, how would this apply to him? And I shared two thoughts with him, which are essentially what I've said to you, I suppose. the two things that I told him to hold on to as well as he could. And those are the assurance of Genesis 15:20 and Romans 8:28 that God is working all things together for our good. In whatever situation you find yourself. In all things, good and bad, happy and sad. This struggle is for your good. It is meant and intended for your good. It's not just that God is using it. You see, we can think of God, I quite like this image, but there's more to it than this. But I like the image of God being a master chess player. Some of us enjoy playing chess. And God is just so far ahead of us in the game that he is the grandmaster, that he can see exactly how things are going to turn out. Well, it's actually better than that. Because when the Bible says God meant it, it takes it further back, doesn't it? This is the intent. This is the point of intention. We don't know how this works. This is mysterious to us. But even the bad things, even the awful things that happen to us, are intended by God somehow for our everlasting good. But add to also that assurance that all things are working to our good of those who love Him. Add to that the promise of sufficient grace. That was the other thing I gave to my brother. The Bible promises, just as God promised to Paul in 2 Corinthians 12, that grace would be sufficient for him. In other words, he'd have enough strength to cope with whatever his thorn in the flesh was. Whatever struggle that was, whatever pain that was. It sounds very painful, doesn't it? A thorn in the flesh. And God promised, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. I will give you enough strength for this. And those are two things to hold on to, aren't they? And grip them as tightly as you can, God helping you. The truth about God's providence, all things in His hands. And sufficient grace. Grace for today, enough grace for today, for the present struggle, for whatever you're facing. Hold tight to those. And now let's pray. Our Father, as we struggle with trials and temptations of all kinds, we so easily fall into hateful thoughts and bitter envy and all kinds of other sins. Please help us to hold on to these two truths, that you are working in all things for the good of those who love you, and that you will give us enough grace to cope and even to overcome, to be more than conquerors through Him who loved us, so that we may live such good lives, even in the midst of great difficulty, that others may see them and praise you, our Heavenly Father. Amen.